Hello, hello. It's Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Let me know in the live chat if you can see me and hear me. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. You might have noticed we skipped last week's live stream of the podcast, and I didn't do one yesterday because I was away at the NAMM show, the National Association of Music Merchants is what that's called. It's one of the biggest shows in pro audio and just music in general, guitars, keyboards, all sorts of instruments. It's been happening every year for decades now. I've probably been going to this show for more than a decade. And it's often been a place where brands announce new gear. And it's often been a place that is absolutely huge. The NAMM show is, man, it's like the ultimate Guitar Center, Sam Ash, whatever music store you go to, like all smushed into one. But if you follow the coverage of the NAMM show, a lot of folks will tell you that it was dead this year. R.I.P. NAMM show, no longer relevant. Is that true? I'm getting comments coming in through the live chat. One of them says, "You look sunburned, Justin." This is actually, I usually don't do jujitsu the days of the podcast. I usually just do a technical jujitsu morning. I am fresh back from people grinding my face with their entire bodies, sometimes with gis on. So my face is sometimes a little red after jiu-jitsu. So in case anyone's wondering, also maybe my color correction needs some work. So if anyone wonders why I have a nice ruddy complexion today, it's mostly from being abused and abusing other people for my hobby that's outside of music. But staying on track, I'm going to try not to get too distracted by the live chat, but I actually do want to hear from you guys as we go along. I have a whole bunch of my top picks of the coolest new gear from the show and some general takeaways of the show. But as we go along, I want to hear from you guys. If you heard of any new pieces of gear that I didn't cover, put them into the chat. We'll look at them together right now. And if you have your own insights into this show and how it compared to past shows, definitely let me know. Before I give you the overview of all the coolest new gear and my takeaway about, is NAMM really dead? Is NAMM still relevant in the day of live streaming, webcasts, videos, stuff like that? We'll get into that in just a minute. Before I do that, the only thing I got to do to keep this podcast free is to give you the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. The most important sponsor being you. How do you sponsor this podcast? The best way is to sponsor yourself. Check out one of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Compression Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified. They will change the way you work forever for the better, guaranteed, or your money back. Also, you can sponsor yourself by becoming a member of this channel. There's a join button down at the bottom. Unless you're on a Apple iOS device, then you might have to go to your browser to join. But right now, it's just $5 a month to join, and you get access to live Q&A sessions with me. We're going to do one next week, and live mix feedback sessions where we'll go under the hood on your mixes and give you really precise constructive criticism on how to improve them. Also sponsoring this week, Loudon Audio. They're making the lovely LS208 microphone I'm speaking to right now. I've switched over to this one for the podcast for now, and I'm absolutely loving the sound of it. Hope you do too. Also, big shout out and thanks to Soundtoys and GPU Audio. And to make the sponsor section super short, let's just get right into my thoughts on the show. And we'll come back to Soundtoys and GPU Audio because they had some cool new releases at the show. All right, let's get into it. Is NAMM dead? Is NAMM dying? I've got to say no. 2019, 2020, NAMM was as big as ever. And then, of course, we know the entire world shut down and there was no such thing as in-person conventions for a while. They've just started to come back. And I've got to say, brands have been a little apprehensive to spend as much as they did. They don't know what these shows coming back, what the turnout's going to be like. So this is probably the smallest NAMM show I've ever been to as far as the footprint on the floor, how many booths there were, how big those booths were. And some of the biggest names in pro audio weren't there, but they were there. For instance, I'll throw out a couple of names. Met with Focusrite, one of the biggest brands in pro audio, occasional sponsor of this podcast. They make great stuff. They actually have acquired a bunch of my favorite brands, Atom Audio, Sonox. They're doing great things, especially at the entry level of the market. They have like the whole thing. They have it figured out what people coming into audio want, and they have super high-end stuff too. And often they have really big booths at NAMM. This year, no booth. Universal Audio often has like the big mamma jamma booth, like the booth that gets everyone talking. They didn't have a booth. But guess what? Both companies were there. Even brands who didn't want to spend on booths, I can't tell you the number of brands I met with who didn't have a booth. And they were like, we'll just meet somewhere at the show, or can we meet over at the media center, Justin, where all the journalists hang out? So people were there. I can't think of a brand. Maybe I can think of like one or two brands who didn't have a booth and also didn't have a presence. But most of the brands you'd expect to have a booth that didn't have a booth, they were there anyway. So somehow it's still relevant to them. And I'm going to give you my pitch for why trade shows like this are still relevant in this day and age. And then we'll get into the gear and we'll look at pictures. I've got visual aids for you again. On this show, we'll open up my browser and take a look at a bunch of this gear together. I have a bunch of images for you. But before we do that, I just want to give you my pitch for why I think this was a great show, why it was a lot of fun for me, and why something like this is still relevant today. I got to tell you, back in 2014 or 2015, when we started MixCon, I was actually of a similar opinion to people who are now saying, NAMM, it's irrelevant. We don't need trade shows anymore. We have YouTube. And when we started the MixCon show, I was like, half the time at NAMM, people aren't even showing their gear to end consumers. They're talking to like their distributor networks, and they're talking to journalists, and they're meeting those people. And it's actually not even that great of a format for getting your gear in front of like the right person who might be into it as an end purchaser. And video is better for that. And if we put on an event like MixCon where people are just coming to check out mixes and doing that in person, and we can have a whole bunch of pro audio brands there that are super relevant to that, the quality of the conversations they're going to have is going to be amazing. They're just going to be speaking to like the ideal end listeners or end users of their products in person. And that was part of the physical idea of an event like MixCon, which we're doing again virtually this year, hopefully in person next year. But I've got to say, there's something to be said for, if you're a pro audio brand, meeting with a bunch of journalists, meeting with a bunch of YouTubers, meeting with your distributor network, and doing that all at once. My goodness, I was there at NAMM for 3 days. I had back-to-back meetings every half hour on the half hour for 3 days straight. Man, like 8 hours a day of meetings, probably like 16 meetings a day almost for 3 days. You do the math. I'm talking about like 40 to 60 meetings in a condensed 3-day period. For me to do that via Zoom calls with all of these brands, like no one would ever make that happen. You can literally have a year's worth of conversations in 3 days at a trade show like this. And I think that's what they're most relevant for. Even if a new modern strategy for brands is not showing off their gear at a trade show to end customers, or people can learn about the stuff in a YouTube video, there's something about getting face-to-face with people, having those conversations in a really condensed, time-efficient way, totally worth the bill to travel out there, in my humble opinion. As me, someone who occasionally works with sponsors, just how ready people were to see each other face-to-face and just move forward with something. That was the thing I was most amazed about at NAMM. It was like some of the most high-quality networking I've ever done, in the sense that like every brand that I met with, they were like, yeah, let's do something. They were just like ready to move forward. And I think there's something about connecting with people in person, face to face, that is different than email and is potentially different from things like Zoom calls or video calls. You just get to use your whole intuitive judgment about a person and say, yeah, let's do something, or let's not. And that was one of the most inspiring things, is just talking to people, seeing them excited to talk about their gear with others and to move forward on things. Now, if we are going to talk, I'll put one little dim note on this. Man, I'm almost 10 minutes in the podcast and we haven't started talking about the gear yet. But I'll put my one little dim note on this. People are doing these clickbaity titles on YouTube about how NAMM is dying. No one has done a video on like what's happened to L.A. Have any of you been out there? Since the world shut down and opened back up, LA is different, man. There is this dichotomy between this display of wealth and people living in tent cities everywhere, on every freeway entrance and exit. And talking to people living there who are like, no, we feel safe because we have bars on the windows. Now, this is a cyclical thing, what happens in cities, but my visit to Los Angeles just really cemented home for me a change that has been happening across the music industry and across the culture, and it's a generational shift. And I've seen these generational shifts happen before in my lifetime. But right now, you know, California has a lot of moving trucks going out of it to other states. And I'm not saying that LA is going to totally die. It's the second most populous city in America. It's going to remain that. But I've got to say, just like in my parents' generation before me, the baby boomer generation, I'm the oldest of the millennials. I was born in 1982. The baby boomers, at a certain point, they grew up in the cities, a lot of these people, and then they moved out to the suburbs and to some degree, smaller urban markets. And that's what's happening, I think, with the millennial generation now, and may continue with the Gen Z generation, where even creative people who would have in the past flocked to Brooklyn. And then when they felt they got priced out of Brooklyn, they flocked to LA. They're flocking out of those places into smaller markets. And me, case in point, I'm the oldest of the millennials, slightly ahead in age of some of them. I moved out in 2017 from New York City to New Hampshire to start a family. And I'm in a city here in a college town. And it was an amazing move for me. And I'm not saying you, if you live in LA or New York and you absolutely love it, that you should get out. I'm not saying anything like that. But there is a trend, and there are trends that have been accelerating because of the world locking down and then opening back up. And I think one of the trends that accelerated was people moving out of the major cities and into smaller markets. And ultimately, I think that's good for art. It's good for there to be creative people all across the country and all across the world with local flavors in different places. Have you been noticing this in your own life and in your own travels? Let me know in the comments. Let me know in the live chat. But that was one of my takeaways, that in 2011 or 2012, I've been covering every single year how many audio engineer jobs there are and where they are. And I've written a blog post about that almost every year for the 10 years, more than that I've been writing for SonicScoop. And there was a year in 2011 or 2012 where it went from there being more audio engineers in New York City than LA. It was like double the number of in New York versus LA. And then like one year they evened 50-50. And then one year there were like twice as many audio engineers in LA than in New York. And it happened over this like 2 to 3 year period. Like everyone moved en masse. And I'll be interested to look at those numbers again. They usually come out every May, and just see if there are the reality of people shifting away from LA, maybe to markets like Austin and others. And I don't think it's just an LA thing. I think it's all around the world. With that said, with people moving to smaller markets, in a way, it's more important than ever to occasionally come together face to face in the big markets, at least once or twice a year, and have those face to face engagements that you can build a whole year's worth of remote collaboration off of. But there is something about people coming together in person physically. All right, enough of my yammering about whether NAMM is dead or not. I just did my whole 13-minute episode, right, about how whether NAMM is dead, and everyone's done their 13-minute episode about that. Let's get into the gear of NAMM, and let me know what you're thinking. Some people here are saying that they're all moving to Berlin, says Josh. And I've actually got some intel that one of the other markets that people are talking about, I hope I pronounced this correctly. What's the major city in Portugal? Is it Lisbon? Is that how you say it? That's like, to some people, the next Berlin. But I also think that a lot of smaller markets in America are seeing an influx, and they're thriving and increasing in population and increasing in economic activity as some of those major urban centers die down. And we're seeing this thing in LA, man, where it's like, it's becoming a donut, like has happened to Detroit and Chicago before. And hopefully they won't go too far down that road. But, you know, once these processes get in motion, they almost never get better before they get worse. Look at New York City in the 1970s and 1980s as an example of that. And I feel like we're in a period now that's like the 1970s, where more and more people are moving out of those major markets to smaller markets, especially those who are interested in starting families and having like a reasonable cost of living. I'm sorry to hang on this topic. The last thing I gotta say about this topic is I've seen some inflation here in New Hampshire, like, you know, prices of eggs doubling and all that stuff, food prices going up. You go to the grocery store, you go to the gas pump, and prices are higher. In LA, prices were double across the board compared to New Hampshire. It was nuts. I thought I'd see inflation here. Whew, man. The only thing that was cheaper in LA than New York was a cab ride. And I think that's because it's a car culture. But anyway, if you went to NAMM and you only hung out around Anaheim, you probably didn't see some of the things I'm talking about. But if you go into LA or you've been in LA, I think you know what I'm talking about. Let me know in the comments or the chat if you think I'm overstating the case or if you've seen something similar and if you've seen some similar trends. All right, let's get into talking about the fun stuff we're actually here for, the audio gear nerdy stuff. Let me go over to sharing my screen. Hopefully I'm not sharing anything terrible here. Nope, I'm not. Here are the gear, my favorite pieces of gear from NAMM. And I'm going to start with our sponsors' gear. Two sponsors of this episode are Soundtoys and DPU Audio. So I'm going to start with those guys. But honestly, even if Soundtoys weren't sponsoring, they're like one of my favorite pro audio brands of all time. And the new plugin they made is honestly genuinely cool. It is called Superplate. If you haven't taken a look at, this is what it looks like. It was just announced at NAMM. They're one of the brands, a few brands who really did a big new release announcement at NAMM. And this is exciting because although Soundtoys has come out with the effects rack, they've come out with new presets, they've updated their compatibility with VST3, they've done all the stuff, the silicon chip compatibility, they haven't released a new plugin in years. And this one is out. And Superplate is like a bigger, more complex version of their Little Plate. And their Little Plate was a really popular plugin, super simple, easy to use, great sounding reverb. This one is, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different classic plate reverbs in one. There's the classic EMT 140 plate, there's the 240 plate, and there's these 3 others that get quirkier and more esoteric as you get along. And there's, I'd say, 2 features here that really makes this different than other delays that I've tried. And we'll talk about those in a second. But under the hood, one of the other things that's happening is there are impulse responses. Like if you ever have the opportunity to go visit the Soundtoys headquarters in Burlington, please do. Ken Bogdanowicz, the creator of Soundtoys, he has a museum's worth of every weird piece of audio gear, synths, reverbs. They had, I think, 4 or 5 different EMT 140 plates there at the headquarters. They listened to all of them, picked their favorite, and modeled that one. And they've got all this esoteric gear to model. So they have modeled some really interesting, really vibey sounding plates. And I was impressed by the sound character here. Not only do you have the classic plate everyone's heard, the EMT 140, there are some awesomely unusual sounding plates. But one of the cool things about this is they started with impulse responses. There is a kind of convolution reverb element here, but they made it much better and much more tweakable than the average convolution reverb. Without getting too technical into how they've done this, and some of that is probably some secret sauce, if you are familiar with traditional impulse response convolution reverbs, when you adjust the decay time on them, it's kind of like choppy. It always sounds weird, like there's this kind of chunky issue with adjusting the reverb time, where it's never smooth to adjust them in a conventional impulse response reverb. But they totally made this as easy to adjust in real time as a conventional algorithmic reverb with the kind of sound quality and realism enhancements of a convolution IR reverb. So I think that's one cool thing. As far as features go, though, you'll see there's 3 icons here. There's a tube icon, a transistor icon, and like a straight wire with gain icon. So you can model the tube circuitry in some of these old school plates, the transistor circuitry in some of these plates, or just have it be like only the plate sounds modeled, nothing else. And I've got to say, it was impressive just how different each of these sounded. It was subtle but significant, you know? And the tube one was a little hairy. You get this upper mid-range kind of like bite and interest and graininess that I just loved. And then you switch over to the transistor one and it becomes so much smoother. It's like good transistor, you know, the kinds of transistors that pro audio gears nerd out about. And then the straight wire with gain one, it's like, oh, that's just like what a flat digital reverb sounds like, you know, and each one of them is distinctive and I like that. But the coolest thing about this one, and I think this is genuinely cool, is this auto decay function. If you click the tweak knob or button on this plugin, this menu drops down and you can adjust this thing called auto decay. So here's the cool thing about the little plate. You could set this thing to infinity delay. But the problem is with setting something to infinity delay, say you've got a guitar plugged in or you've got a snare drum going in there, with infinity delay, or infinity reverb time, I should say, every guitar strum stacks on top of the one before it. Every snare drum hit stacks on the one on top of it before. So you get this bigger and bigger mess, this cloud of reverb. And it doesn't even have to be infinity for that to happen. It can start happening at, you know, with a 3 or 4 second reverb time. Now, these long reverb times of 3 and 4 and 6 and 8 seconds can often sound so cool and so inspiring for one hit, but by the time the next hit comes along, they become this wash that's unusable. But this totally solves that. One solution people have had for this issue in the past is like reverb ducking, where say you have a snare drum hit and then you have a really long reverb time. The next time a snare drum hits, the tail of the reverb ducks down. And that's been one solution. You don't see it in many reverbs, but it's a creative way of dealing with this issue. But Soundtoys has gone even further with it. They've made it a auto decay time change. So you set your target, so you could set your reverb time here to 16 seconds, 32 seconds, longer than you'd get in any real plate. But you can have this target of, hey, when a new hit comes around, we're basically going to like empty out the memory bin of the reverb to a degree. We're going to change it from a 16-second reverb time down to a 1-second reverb time just for a flash when this new hit comes in. So it almost like resets the buffer. So you can have this long, swimming, beautiful delay, but when a new hit from your instrument comes in that's above the threshold, it kind of like clears it, sets it back to a really short delay for a second. And then all of a sudden, you have this ability to have this rich, super long tail that you otherwise couldn't do, but have it be clean at the same time. You really got experience in person. I hope I've done it justice in the way that I've explained it. But if you like really long reverb tails, but you find that they're unwieldy and they get cluttered too easily, this auto decay where you set a threshold, new hit comes in, and it momentarily shortens and kind of clears the buffer of that delay. A beautiful addition. I haven't seen this before in other plugins, and I thought a really cool approach to this problem. All right. Next big folks. Also soundtoys.com. You can try out anything they make for free for 30 days. Those guys are sponsors on the podcast, so big thanks to them. Genuinely love the plugin. Another set of guys who are sponsoring this this time are GPU Audio. And I should tell you that you can try out anything those guys make for free as well over at gpu.audio/SonicScoop. But over here, there's the beta suite. They have this free set of plugins that runs on the GPU inside your computer. And if you need more processing power for your plugins, but you don't want to like go out and buy some accelerated hardware like Universal Audio makes or Antelope makes to offload from your computer, they offload this stuff onto your GPU. The thing that's in there to play movies, render video games, is practically an untouched resource in your computer. And they have a free bundle. Go over to gpu.audio/sonic-scoop. That's gpu.audio/sonic-scoop. You can try this stuff out for free. They've got some plugins for Mac and a whole bunch more for PC. But they announced that they're going to be working with a whole bunch of virtual instrument brands. I thought that was interesting. They had one of the bigger, more interesting booth displays over there at the show. I think they announced that they're working with the Vienna Symphony library, so you can now run those instruments off of your GPU. And I think, was it one of the Mach synthesizers that they're collaborating with? And they're going to have this container plugin, to my understanding, to make it so that you can run other plugins inside of this GPU audio framework. So the idea here is it's not just going to be them making plugins, it's them going to be creating an infrastructure that you can run other brands' plugins off of your GPU. And one of the cool things here is offloading power from your CPU onto your practically unused GPU. But another issue here is you can get way lower latency running these plugins off of a GPU than a CPU. So that's another really exciting thing. So big shout out and thanks to those guys for being a sponsor on this podcast, and definitely check out their stuff. All right. Next up here is PSP. They have a plugin called the Oral Comp, and we saw this actually for the first time. They debuted this at MixCon. This is something that's been happening with brands more and more. Almost every year, we have at least one brand debuting something at Mixcon, and PSP debuted their what was then called the Avocado plugin. And this time they gave us a sneak peek at the more finished version of this plugin. It's now called Oral Comp, but has a little avocado symbol on the plugin. And I've got to say, it looks a lot like their Oral Control thing. This is the first that I know of analog style, multi-channel surround sound compressor that has a whole bunch of linking options for you to link or unlink the surround channels to varying degrees. So you could have the left, right be linked with the center 100% with compression, or just by 50% or 20%, or you can link them to the backs or the sides or the overheads by any percentage you like. So that linking capability with a model of an awesome sounding analog piece of hardware, I believe it's like API 2500 style, very cool. I have their Oral Control pulled up. This one is not officially released yet, but we got a sneak peek of the GUI at an event that Ronald Prent, same guy who debuted this thing at Mixcon, was at. He was showing it off over in the PMC booth. That one was really exciting. And we actually filmed a bit of that and filmed an interview with Ronald Prent about it. We'll be coming out with that one soon. All right. Next one I've got to show you guys that I heard that I thought was amazing. This is another brand we've featured on the channel in the past. You might have seen my, have a fairly popular look at their IN8 speakers, which are fantastic for the price. They're probably the best sounding pair of speakers for under $1,000 that I've ever used for the studio, and they're well under $1,000. Now, they have come out with a new set of speakers, this SM series, Project Santa Monica, they're calling it. And this is Cali Audio, instead of trying to make the best affordable speaker, they're like, man, what if we could spend $1,000 per speaker? What if we were going to make good high-end studio monitors? And we were going to do that with a price point of like $1,000 per speaker, $2,000. What would we do? And this is the answer. And I got to hear them, and they're marvelous sounding speakers. They're both pretty but flat at the same time. So, I mean, no speakers are completely flat, but the Cali Audio feel skews towards flat and useful over trying to just impress you. And I think that's one of the strengths of the brand. And one of the reasons their LP6 monitors have done so well and their IN8 and IN5 monitors have done so well is that instead of trying to impress you with how flamboyantly good the speakers sound, they impress you with like, oh, my mixes sound good when I work on these. Particularly the IN series, which just brings the mid-range into such detail. And they do that because they are three-way monitors. There's a driver for the woofer, driver for the mid-range, driver for the tweeter. They look like a two-way monitor because the tweeter is sitting inside of the mid-range driver. This Project Santa Monica speaker, $1,000 each, $2,000 for the pair, same concept. We have a coaxial speaker here where our tweeter is sitting inside of our mid-range driver, and we have a slightly smaller driver than on the IN8, but I guess it's more efficient because it goes deep. I mean, I was hearing real information in the 40 hertz range. I always bring up one of my reference tracks is this track, Elephant Woman by the band Blonde Redhead. And it starts off with a kick drum in there in the first few seconds that I think is like 42 or 44 hertz. And I always want to see how speakers reproduce that. And it did it surprisingly well and surprisingly low in resonance for having such a large looking port on the front of the design. The top speaker is a little bit recessed in, so it gives us, you know, a little bit more phase coherence, and there's kind of a waveguide thing going on here. So beautiful sounding speakers. If you like the Cali vibe, but you want something even higher performance with even faster transient response, they'll give you even more transient detail than the IN series does. These are great. Only catch to them is that they are a passive monitor, so you need to get an amp separately, but they recommend an amp with it, and that probably adds on about $700, but you could use a wide variety of amps with it. So that was one that was unveiled at the show that I thought was really interesting, really worth checking out. All right, next one that I think is really fun. Let me know if you guys are digging the picks so far, and let me know if you have any of your own picks here. I'm going to check off and see if we have any more comments coming in here. I'll read through a little bit more of these later. But if I miss any of your favorite picks, or if you have comments about these, let me know and I'll put them in here. If you have a comment you absolutely want read out, you can feel free to put it into a super chat. But our next thing here is the pump from Empirical Labs. Love these guys. This is another one of my favorite brands where I got to tell you, so many of the brands we've worked with as sponsors on SonicScoop, like, I love these brands. Like, I loved them before I had anything to do with SonicScoop, and now I get to work with them, and Empirical Labs is one of them. You probably know about the distressor compressor is probably the most ubiquitous hardware compressor of the modern era that's in every studio. And they finally, after having requests for like a decade at least, made a 500 series version of the distressor called the pump. They have two 500 series things before this, a de-esser and another thing, which is a little bit of a sleeper, which we can talk about in a minute. But the pump, I think this one's going to be popular. It is a way to get into a hardware distressor at a much lower price. I only wish that they had put this out years ago before there were great plug-in emulations of the distressor, which sound pretty good. But for those who want the hardware and they want it more accessible or more channels of it, I think this is going to be super useful. And I mean, it's a compact distressor for less money. The only thing it's lacking, it doesn't have the British mode button and one other button that's on the main distressor. But otherwise works totally like a distressor, great sounding compression. And if you're in the hardware world and into hardware, definitely worth checking out. Okay, another company here I should talk about, another one of my favorites I want to mention, Antelope Audio. So they had a few things that they announced. They announced that they're going native with their plugins. And this is great for a few reasons. Their software hardware deal is a lot like Universal Audio, where, let me make sure, are you guys seeing my screen here? I'm not sure if I lost my screen share thing here. Let me see. Let me know if you're seeing my screen, because right now I'm just seeing myself. Give me 1 second here. Do I feel like I've lost it? Oh, no. You guys haven't been seeing me very well with me. Whoop. There, that wasn't supposed to happen. Give me 1 second, guys, while I fix this little issue here. I don't know how to get this back where I can share my screen. Type hotkey F. There we go. Now you guys see my screen, yeah? Should I take you through these pictures again? Here's the super plate we were talking about with the auto decay function. Really cool plugin. You should be seeing my screen again now. Sorry for the issue there. This one, awesome, the auto decay function. Here is look at GPU audio we were talking about. Here's the PSP Avocado we were talking about. Here's its GUI. Here's the Kali Audio Project Santa Monica, the SM series. Here is that pump from Empirical Labs. And now back on to Antelope Audio. So you can now use their plugins, which are great sounding. I mean, these are excellent plugins. You can now use them totally natively. You don't have to use the hardware. They don't have all of them ported over yet. And this is useful even to people who own the Antelope hardware, because one of the only drawbacks to using the Antelope DSP-powered plugins is they didn't run super easily in your DAW like the Universal Audio stuff did. And now this new version, where it's totally native, will run in your DAW without needing to use any additional software that makes the process slightly less than seamless. Only drawback to them is subscription only for this stuff. But I'm a big fan of subscriptions. You know, I work with Plugin Alliance a lot. I think they're one of the best brands to do subscriptions. They didn't mess it up like some brands who have been in the news lately, just cutting off people as perpetuals and getting people mad. And I don't think Antelope is handling this badly either. I like the idea of subscriptions. I've switched over to subscriptions for a lot of stuff just because I can kind of pay for it as I use it. And like I use Adobe Premiere for the video editing and their Photoshop, and just switching over to not having to buy those and getting them updated all the time using software as a service has been great for me. I know there's some people who hate subscriptions. I'm not one of them. But if you don't hate subscriptions and you like good sounding software, these guys are another great option for that. One of the other things that they announced at the show was, I believe they have a new Orion interface. Oh, it looks like they're doing a sale on some of their software here. But one of the other things that these guys announced was a new speaker called the Atlas i8. And I've got to say, I haven't seen something like this before. If you went to the NAMM show, you might have seen this Antelope speaker. They had a cutaway here. It is once again a coaxial design, a closed back coaxial design, where it's a non-ported speaker. But the really interesting thing here is there's basically two woofers, one in front of the other. So let me see if I can pull that back up. Here's a picture of it. We've got this mid-range driver, this tweeter, and here's the main woofer. Oh, I'm sorry, it is a ported design. There is a port in here. But I believe there's like two chambers inside, one of which has a port and one doesn't, something like that. But there's two woofers, one in back of the other, that allows it to go super deep in a low distortion way. I've never seen this before on a speaker, where you practically have two sets of speakers, one in front of the other for the woofer. And I thought that was a really interesting innovation. Didn't get to really listen to it very well at NAMM, but I thought it was a cool speaker design that really allows it to go deeper than a speaker this size should. So definitely something to check out. Next thing, talking about the world of speakers, this is another kind of subtle innovation that's come out, isoacoustics. My monitors are sitting on isoacoustic pucks right now that decouple them from my monitor stands, but they've come up with a system for speaker mounting that's decoupled, that's relatively affordable, and could be great for Atmos and multi-channel installation purposes. All right, last couple here. SSL, Solid State Logic, was there. They had some stuff to show off. They had a new plugin that was based on their B series compressors, and I think it's a tease of some new stuff they're going to be coming out with. But they were also showing off some of their large format consoles, which we're going to take a closer look at on the channel in some depth. And then one other thing that a lot of people mentioned to me that I didn't see personally was the Icon control surfaces. I was not familiar with the brand Icon proaudio, but they are making these fader pack control surfaces, and they announced a newer one that was 8 channels. I can't remember if it was this Platform M or something slightly different, but they have these modular systems that people had mentioned to me as really liking the price point that they were fitting in, and kind of the modular expandability of them. And I've been an advocate for a long time of trying to get more and more affordable options going for control surfaces, because I think it really is something to having tactile control. You don't get all the benefits of analog that way, but you get some of them. Now, for because I totally messed up, I thought you were seeing my screen and you weren't. Let's take a quick look at these again. We were talking about the super plate. You can set this to longer reverb times than you found on, I think, any plate reverb in the past. It's a convolution reverb with some of the benefits of an algorithmic reverb. And the really cool innovation here is that you can have kind of not ducking. It's better than ducking. It's like clearing your reverb buffer. And GPU audio, again, check those guys out, gpu.audio/SonicScoop. Definitely want to check out this stuff. They have more stuff coming, going to be collaborating with Virtual Instruments soon, which I think is going to be awesome because of the speed that you can get off of working off the GPU. PSP audio, Kali audio, and then you guys saw my screen for the rest of these. 2 more that I skipped over, you haven't seen yet. Beyerdynamic. This is something they announced at NAMM, but it's not something new. It's really a reskinning of their most popular pro audio mics ever. They've changed their body designs and they're making them all look similar. But these are, honestly, guys, some of the best mics ever made. Some of my favorites. I own almost all of these mics. I own one of these, the 88, the M88. I own one of these, the M160. I own one of these, the M103. I own one of these, the M201. The M201 was a snare drum mic I took everywhere. If you haven't used the M201 on snare, do yourself a service and check it out. It's like somewhere in between a Shure SM57 and a condenser. And I think it's like such a sleeper mic for snare. And people who've tried it on snare love it, whether you use it top snare, bottom snare. Great dynamic microphone. Tight supercardioid pattern, so it rejects cymbal bleed fairly well. The M130 and especially the M160 are absolutely some of the must-have ribbon mics ever made. They are relatively affordable. The M160 is famously I think When the Levee Breaks drum sound is from that, and the M130 is more of a bidirectional pattern, a favorite for a lot of people on things like horns and strings, and a little bit smoother than the M160. but they're kind of just recommitting to, yes, we have these classic mics, let's update them for new generation. So they announced this kind of reskinning of the brand. So that was another thing that came out. One of my favorite things to come out, though, was right here. This one was announced a little while ago, the MM500 from Audeze. And recently, I believe this one was released at the show, the MM100. These are Manny Marroquin's headphones. We actually did a feature. He announced it to SonicScoop first when he went from mixing in his studio, is it Larrabee Studios, to mixing on a laptop with headphones. He's like, I had to get good headphones, and the headphones for me were the Audeze ones. Now, Glenn Schick, great mastering engineer I've interviewed a few times, he also masters completely on headphones these days, and he's using the Audeze LCD4s. These are $4,500 headphones. The Manny Marroquin ones that he came out with around last year, these MM500s, they are more like $1,600, and I got to hear them for the first time at the NAMM show, and they're amazing. They're really good. I've not heard better headphones at the $1,600 price point. I've heard maybe one or two other models that could like match them for sounding great, but I think these Manny's might be the most useful ones out there. They sound remarkably close to the LCD4s and the new LCD5s that Audeze are showing there. Those flagship $4,500 headphones. This one for $1,600, I've got to say it's like 80% as good, maybe slightly more. Where I hear those LCD4s and those LCD5s and I'm like, oh, I want them. The LCD4s, it almost feels like being in a room with speakers. They have this cool low-end resonance. They go super deep. The LCD5s, they're a little tighter on bottom and really super useful low-end. But then these MM500s, man, you listen to these for $1,600 and you're like, if I'm going to just mix on headphones, these would do it. Like I almost wouldn't need to own speakers, and they kind of do 80 to maybe 90% of what I need out of the higher end headphones. If money was no object, I would still buy the $4,500 headphones that they had. But if money is an object, as it is for many of us, I think these MM500s are definitely something I would recommend. There's at least one other model in this price range that's also worth looking at. And there was a top secret sneak peek I got at two new models that are coming out in this price range that I can't talk about yet, that I think are also going to be stellar for mixing. But if you had to buy something today when this came out, these guys aren't sponsoring this or anything. I just really like them. They came out with a new one, the MM100s, which are way cheaper. They're $300. They're more in that price range of the Sennheiser HD600s. But unlike the Sennheiser HD600s, they actually have usable information in the low frequencies. So for $300 pair of headphones, they're pretty good. I'd say really good and very pleasant to listen to, and they have useful information in the lows. I didn't like them as much as the $1,600 headphones, and for me, the additional price spent on these is worth it. The CEO of the company was telling me, swearing up and down, is like, you know, if you look at these on a frequency chart, these MM100s for $300 spec out almost the same as these MM500s for $1,600. And we were almost like, how are we going to sell both of these speakers? These MM100s for $300 are so close. But me personally listening to a pre-production model they had there, I feel like I heard a difference. I believe that I level match them pretty much as good as you're going to get. And I believe that, to me, these MM500s, even if the frequency response is supposed to be more or less the same, despite maybe a little change around 4K, I just felt like the low end responded better for me, and the transient response was better for me on these MM500s. And for me, it would be worth the additional money on them. So that was something really exciting I tried out. I think mixing on headphones, it's something that people would used to swear up and down at you that you should not do. Don't mix on headphones. But I think that is archaic advice. And in this day and age, if you had $1,600 to spend on monitoring, you could buy $1,600 speakers and you'd be screwed because you'd be putting them in an untreated room. Like if you just bought $1,600 speakers and put them in a room that's just like a room, I don't want to say you wasted your money, but you wasted some of your money. Whereas you'd be better off buying $800 speakers and $800 of acoustic treatment. And now you're getting into a place where you're starting to be able to make reasonably good decisions. Maybe some of those Cali audio speakers, you can get around $1,800-ish price point. And then, maybe some of the smaller Atom speakers, you can get around that price point. There's a lot of good brands to look at. And then putting up some acoustic treatment, maybe DIYing some of it to get even more for your money. You could do that, or you could get a pair of $1,600 headphones that takes the room totally out of the equation and are almost as good as listening on speakers. I think we can finally start saying that for some people, in some cases, may be a more viable choice. So something worth considering. Okay, last couple other quick things that I saw that was cool and new. DPA Audio, new mic kit here, $5,100. Expensive, but super duper flat. If you want your mics to sound exactly how your drums sound, and you want condensers that work in an on-stage context, these drum kits that they have, absolutely good for kind of hi-fi, realistic drum sounds, especially in the live context, but also in studio. Another fun little thing here, Jotter. You can kind of see it here on my screen. It's this new plugin that's basically like taking the SoundCloud comments feature and putting it into a plugin in your DAW. So you open up this plugin, you send somebody a download. Unfortunately, this is the one unfortunate thing for me, is you send your end client download, they open up the app, and then in there they can leave comments, and it shows up in your DAW as markers in your DAW where their comments are. Great functionality. I recommend to these guys. I think the product is really cool. I recommend a couple things to them, and their CEO was taking down notes. He's like, "That's a great idea. We're going to do it." And one of them, I don't know why they need me to think of this, but I'm like, couldn't you make the end user version browser based, where they don't have to download anything, and you just give them a link and they go onto their browser and they put their comments in there? Because that's a function. There's no friction then to me sending a link. Hey, give me your comments. This is where you listen to the track. Put your comments in here. It's a link. That's such a smaller ask to clients. And they were furious. They took that as a note. And they were like, yes, we should do that. Why didn't we think of that? I was thinking the same thing. Why do you think of that? But as it is now, I think potentially useful thing to have in there is like $50. And if they eventually add that browser-based note-taking, I think it'll be a useful thing for a lot of us. And I think that's about it for my main picks from the show. Let me double check here and see if there's anything else that I missed. I've got note here. I also had a great conversation, again, with some brands who weren't there but have some cool stuff coming. I met with oeksound, the makers of Soothe 2. They just came out with Soothe Live, which I think is a super cool thing. It is a low latency version of their Soothe plugin meant for live use. Slightly different algorithm, but that was something cool. And we let people know that there was a special sale on that when it came out. If you want to know about special sales, make sure you go to SonicScoop.com, sign up for the newsletter, and we'll let you know when that stuff comes out. Who else did I meet with here? Access Analog. They've got some new mastering signal chains up there, and that's something I'm going to be taking a deep dive into before too long. Do you guys want me to do something on Access Analog? I was talking to those guys. Basically, it is a technology that allows you to remotely control from a distance real analog hardware and bring up real high-end analog hardware like a plugin in your DAW. They have some new mastering chains that are up there now, and I want to take a deep dive into some of those, more information on that stuff before too long. All right, another set of folks that I met up with here. Let's see. Rad Distribution. They were showing me some really cool hardware. Lindell Audio now has a super cheap version of the 1176 and the LA2A. And these are priced cheaper than I've seen. $400 for an 1176 that is really convincingly 1176-y sounding, and the same thing for an LA2A. I don't think we've ever seen prices quite like this on this hardware made to this level of quality. And one of the cool things they did here is they didn't precisely mimic an exact 1176. They actually had like every single revision of the 1176, and they were like, "Ooh, we like the input section of this one is the best. The compression section of this one's the best. The output section of this one's the best." And man, it's just amazing the kinds of hardware we can get at this price point now. Definitely check out those guys as well. Let me see if there's any more that I'm leaving out here. We went over Empirical Labs. Sonics, I talked to those guys. They make great plugins. They have some more stuff geared towards more of the kind of beginner, and not just beginner, but like newer music producer market. That stuff's coming out. McDSP, I met with those guys. They've got this new plugin for their hardware unit, the APB16, called the Drive. That's very cool. Head, I talked to those guys. I can't tell you very much about meeting them other than that they were really keen to show me their latest models and their headphones and talking about improvements to one or more of those things that are coming. Similar meeting with Austrian Audio. They had some top secret stuff I can't discuss yet, but one of the problems I talked about earlier in this episode, they're working on a solution on that I'm super excited about. Any others that most of these other things, the other meetings that I had, I'm not allowed to talk about. Yeah, that's it for my top picks. I'll visit really quickly your live chats that have come in and see if you guys have any of your own top picks. My apologies that you couldn't see my screen for a little bit, but hopefully the stuff was useful for you anyway. David Springler says the audioscope stuff interested me, mostly everything I saw. I'll have to check that out. Christopher Butler says the Seymour Duncan hyper switch for Strats. It's a 5-position blade switch with an FPGA and Bluetooth receiver. You can completely rewire your pickguard on demand. Oh, that's really interesting. So you're telling me that these, you can drop pickups into your guitar and without having to solder anything, try new pickups in your guitar via Bluetooth. That's pretty cool. The only problem with Bluetooth probably is some high frequency loss. That's not going to matter on an electric guitar. That's very cool. I would love to check that out. The Seymour Duncan hyper switch for Strats. Very interested. Christopher Butler says, completely off topic, but is freaking cool and totally original idea for me as an audio nerd and singer who thinks he's a guitar player. Craig Flower says, thumbs, people, thumbs. Yeah, do hit the like button and all that stuff. Andre says, I hate these spam emails they send after you subscribe. I hear you. You know, hopefully most of those brands that do subscriptions will allow you separate subscriptions to their promotional marketing stuff and stuff that's related to your subscriptions. Craig Flower says, did you see the new Binson Echo Rec? Wicked cool. Oh, I'd love to. It sounds like we're in kind of guitar pedal territory here, although you could use that stuff in a non-guitar pedal context. Chris Butler says, one problem here is that Bluetooth goes dormant after a timeout. I don't think that's really a problem in this particular context of, swapping things out for trying. But I see what you mean. If like it becomes your main gigging guitar, then like does the very beginning of your first strum not get picked up and you have to remember to strum it for like a half a second if it's sensitive to. I don't have that much problem with Bluetooth on my headphones in that regard of going dormant. I don't know, is that device specific? We have to go really nerdy here to go any further. Cindy McGrell says, did you see Stevie Wonder? Oh, last thing I'll end on is people that I saw there. I saw a lot of YouTubers, fellow YouTubers over there. I got to say hi to Cameron of Venus Theory, who's crushing it on his channel. Some of the most beautiful looking YouTube videos that I've seen recently. Met him at the PSP event, and really funny, witty guy in person. He showed me some great photography he was doing of a cross-country trip of his, and a lot of respect for him and his channel. I don't watch a ton of channels in our space, but I know that we used to be bigger than his channel, and in the past year or two, he has like meteoric rise from spending so much effort on those videos. They're like art. But I did ask him, I'm like, dude, let me know, how long are you spending those videos? Each one of those must take 20 to 70 hours to do. And he was like, yeah, each video you see me do is probably 10 days of like, he didn't specifically say full-time work, but that was the vibe that I got, that it's, more than a week of work to put out each of those little 15-minute videos he does. Whereas me, this is me yakking into a camera for an hour, and then I get to be done. Now, pros and cons. This format won't get quite as many views as if I spent 10 days producing the same thing. Beautiful B-roll all over the place. So maybe my hourly rate ends up being a little bit higher, even though the reach isn't quite the same. And man, my engagement would probably be even better if I'd remembered to turn on my screen for you guys in the beginning. So I'm still getting the hang of this live stream stuff. Hopefully, my occasional ineptitude endears me to you rather than just making you think I'm a total idiot. Let's see. Who else did I meet there? There's the guy from, I can't remember him. Who is the Italian guy with the mohawk and the big muscles? I saw him there. It was cool to meet him. And then another YouTuber I met, Chris Graham, formerly of the artist formerly known as the purple shirted co-host on the Six Figure Home Studio podcast. I actually got into the Six Figure Home Studio podcast right before it ended and switched to being now the Six Figure Creatives podcast. Again, I don't follow a ton of stuff in our space. I don't want it like in there influencing me too much. So I mostly, if I go on YouTube, I watch like jiu-jitsu videos and archery videos. And then when I want to talk about audio stuff, like I talk to brands and producers and engineers and mixers, and David Nosey says David Springler. That's who the Mohawk guy was. But Chris Graham's podcast with Brian Hood, I got into, and now it's kind of like not a studio podcast anymore. So they were probably the other best podcast in audio before they went defunct or moved on to greener pastures. Who else was a good one? The UBK Happy Fun Time Hour. A lot of people tell me that their podcast was great, and people who like this podcast seem to like that one. They're no longer around. And then it was really fun talking to Chris Graham. And then the sad thing I saw was Dave Pensado and Herb Trawick, and neither of them were very mobile. It looked like Dave Pensado had lost a lot of weight. He was in a wheelchair, and Herb Trawick with a cane. I wasn't a huge watcher of their show. I usually couldn't get through, to be honest, the entire episode most of the time, but I still have tremendous respect for those guys for what they've done, and just them as people seem like genuinely nice and decent dudes. And I think one of the things that hurt their show is they're such nice and decent dudes. When they hooked up with sponsors, they wanted to be so nice and decent with those sponsors that like they lost some credibility, I think, with their audience. And it was sad to see their show not be as big as it was, because they had this big peak that they had reached. And it was just, I mean, they were smiling as big as ever, but to see them not as mobile, it's just like, I want to see you guys take care of yourself and stick around, because I know a lot of people love what you guys do. And of course, I saw Warren Hewitt walking around. He's hard to miss. He usually has a big entourage. This time his entourage was smaller. They seem to be splitting things up. But you saw, it was interesting to see a whole bunch of YouTube personalities in person, and they were doing the same kind of thing I do, just back-to-back meeting after meeting after meeting, and super useful way, NAMM, to connect with people, whether it's honestly less about connecting with most of you guys, the end users of the products, and it's more about connecting with people who can help spread the word, who can help sell the stuff, distribute it in stores. And I think that's still the strength of NAMM. And even if it shrinks a little bit in size, due to factors like the world shutting down and opening back up, or due to factors like inflation and people not wanting to spend quite as much on booths anymore, I think there's still going to be a place for it, and we're going to see NAMM shows and AES shows for many years to come. And the smaller footprint didn't make it feel any less busy. To be honest, 2 of the afternoons, it was super crowded and sounded like the Guitar Center / Sam Ash of your nightmares if you walked away from the pro audio section over to where all the guitars are. And I gotta say, it was a fun experience. If you've never been to one, I'd still recommend going to one. And that's my takeaway. If you guys have any of your other comments about this, let me know if I missed any of your favorites in the comments down below. Big thanks to you for being here. Shout out and reminder, if you want to sponsor this podcast, the best way to do it is to sponsor yourself. Check out one of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, or Compression Breakthroughs. And also, consider becoming a member of this podcast. $5 a month, you become a member of the whole YouTube channel. You get access to a whole bunch of exclusive videos, live Q&As with me. We're doing one next week, the mix feedback sessions, and a whole bunch more. Also, big thanks to GPU Audio. Check out anything they make. Actually, check out, their whole suite of free stuff that you can try over at gpu.audio/SonicScoop. That's gpu.audio/SonicScoop. I'm just realizing I'm showing you guys my entire screen. I need to get better at this live stream stuff instead of just my browser. My goodness. And also Soundtoys. Check out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.